On a frigid winter evening, a lone man spotted 3 dogs silently pacing at the edge of his property. Instead of baring fangs or growling, these majestic yet desperate creatures appeared pleading, pawing at his door, as though begging for refuge. When he finally opened that door, he couldn't have anticipated the life-altering moment that awaited him. What exactly did these frozen dogs want? And why would they choose a human's warm hearth over the wild they called home? Warren Pierce was no stranger to harsh winters, having lived in the remote Alaskan countryside all his life. He was well acquainted with sub-zero temperatures and howling winds. His log cabin, sturdy and weather-beaten, stood as a testament to years of surviving in one of the world's most unforgiving climates. Yet, despite his rugged experience, nothing could have prepared him for the sight that greeted him late one snowy evening. It had been an ordinary day, or as ordinary as it could be in the dead of winter. Warren had chopped enough firewood to last the night and checked on his small vegetable greenhouse, which was kept alive by a single heater. As dusk fell, he retreated indoors, content to spend the long dark hours by his crackling fireplace with a mug of hot tea. Then came a strange scratching at his front door, accompanied by soft whines that cut through the night's silence. At first, Warren assumed it was a stray, perhaps a lone feral dog from the outskirts of town. But when he peered out the frosted window, his heart began to pound. There, shivering on his porch, stood 3 emaciated dogs. Their once proud coats were matted and dusted with snow, their breaths visible in the frozen air. Instead of snarling or acting aggressively, they trembled from cold and exhaustion. One even mustered a weak whine, as if calling for help. Warren's instincts battled with his caution. Dogs, especially feral ones, could be unpredictable, but these animals didn't appear threatening. They looked desperate. Against his better judgment, Warren grabbed a flashlight and cautiously cracked open his door. The closest dog took a shaky step forward, its glowing eyes filled not with hostility, but with a pleading intensity. In that moment, any fear he felt was overwhelmed by a surge of compassion. What had driven these creatures to seek shelter from a human? And if he let them in, would his act of kindness invite danger into his home? As he opened the door wider, the 3 dogs cautiously padded into the cabin. The moment their paws met the cabin's warmth, a visible shudder of relief passed through them. Warren carefully closed the door behind them, sealing out the howling winter. It was then that Warren noticed something even more concerning. One of the dogs, a smaller one, with a patch of grey across its back, was limping heavily, favoring its hind leg. Its ribs were sharply visible under its thin coat. It was injured, possibly severely. Thus began an extraordinary encounter between a solitary man and 3 wild dogs. An encounter that would test Warren's compassion, challenge his instincts, and lead to an outcome no one could have ever predicted. As the 3 dogs crossed the threshold into Warren's cabin, a fragile sense of peace wrapped itself around the room, broken only by the low whistle of wind outside and the occasional trembling whimper from the exhausted animals. Warren closed the door behind them carefully, his heart hammering against his ribs, the enormity of what he had just done slowly settling on his shoulders. He stood there for a moment, unsure whether to move, watching as the dogs, wild, battered, and foreign, gathered themselves awkwardly in the center of his living room. Their fur, once likely full and proud, now hung in thin, damp clumps along their shivering bodies. The smallest among them, a young-looking dog with a dusting of grey across its back, collapsed onto the worn rug in front of the fireplace, letting out a soft, pained whine as it struggled to tuck its injured leg under itself. Warren's throat tightened at the sound. He hadn't been prepared for this, the vulnerability, the rawness of it all. These weren't the dangerous beasts he'd half feared when he cracked open the door. They were survivors, desperate and broken from a battle with the elements far crueler than anything a human could deliver. For a long moment, none of them moved. The fire crackled and popped in the hearth, casting long shadows along the cabin's rough-hewn walls. The two larger dogs stood protectively around the smaller one, their bodies tense yet trembling with exhaustion, eyes never leaving Warren as if silently pleading, asking for a mercy they hardly dared hope for. Slowly, cautiously, Warren moved toward the fire, adding another log to bolster the flickering flames. The warmth deepened immediately, curling around the room in soothing way. The dogs flinched at the sudden movement, but when Warren knelt down and stretched his hands toward the fire, simply sitting there, breathing, not asking anything of them, they seemed to relax a little, their bodies sinking lower to the floor. It was instinct, more than thought, that drove Warren to rise again and head toward the small pantry tucked into the corner of the cabin. His supplies were modest: canned goods, a few loaves of frozen bread, dried meat he'd smoked himself, but he rummaged carefully until he found a bundle of venison he had planned to cook for himself. His stomach twisted with uncertainty. Feeding wild dogs could be a terrible mistake. If they grew too comfortable, too dependent, they might lose the few survival instincts they still clung to. But looking at them now, the hollowed ribs, the two large eyes dulled by hunger, Warren couldn't find it in himself to turn them away. He carved the meat into small strips, laid it out on a battered metal plate, and set it carefully down on the floor a few feet from where they huddled. Then he stepped back, hands raised slightly to show he meant no harm. For a long minute, none of the dogs moved. Warren held his breath, afraid even a twitch would break the fragile trust between them. Then slowly, the largest dog, a broad-shouldered creature with a scar slicing across its muzzle, edged forward. It sniffed the air, trembling legs carrying it warily toward the plate. After a few cautious sniffs, it snatched up a strip of meat and retreated, chewing frantically. The second dog followed, more hesitant, its paws leaving faint prints on Warren's worn wooden floor. Finally, the smallest dog lifted its head, eyes glassy with pain, and crawled toward the food, dragging its injured leg behind it. Warren's heart broke at the sight. He wanted to help, to scoop the poor creature into his arms, to promise that everything would be all right, but he knew better. Trust had to be earned, not forced. So he sat back down by the fire, watching as the three dogs devoured the food with a desperation that spoke of many days without a real meal. When the plate was licked clean, they slumped back onto the floor, bellies full but bodies still quivering with exhaustion. The injured dog tucked itself against the belly of the largest one, who immediately wrapped a protective paw around. Warren exhaled slowly, feeling an unexpected weight lift off his chest. These dogs, they weren't just surviving, they were clinging to each other, refusing to surrender to the brutal world outside. That spirit, that loyalty, moved something deep inside him. Rising again, he pulled down a few old blankets from a shelf and laid them near the fire. The dogs watched him, but didn't move, their eyes following every motion. Carefully, Warren spread the blankets out into a rough nest, then stepped back once more. It didn't take long before the injured dog, shivering uncontrollably now, limped over and collapsed into the warmth. Its companions followed, curling around it, creating a tangled heap of fur and gentle breathing. For the first time in what must have been weeks, they slept without fear gnawing at their bellies. Warren crouched nearby, resting his elbows on his knees, studying them in the firelight. Questions crowded his mind. Where had they come from? Had they been abandoned, born wild? Were they part of a larger pack, now lost to snow and cold? The smaller dog whimpered softly in its sleep, its paw twitching against the blanket. Without thinking, Warren scooted a little closer and gently draped another blanket over its thin frame. The dog stirred, eyes cracking open briefly, and for the first time, Warren saw a flicker of something that wasn't fear, something that looked dangerously close to hope. He smiled sadly. Hope was a heavy thing to carry, especially out here, where nature rarely gave second chances. As the wind howled beyond the cabin walls, rattling the windows and pushing snow up against the door, Warren made a silent decision. These dogs had found him, whether by chance, instinct, or some desperate miracle, and he would not turn his back on them now. They had trusted him enough to cross the threshold. Now he would do the same. He grabbed another log for the fire, coaxing the flames higher, and pulled an old rocking chair closer to the hearth. As he settled into it, the dogs stirred but didn't flee. He could feel their eyes on him, even as they drifted back into uneasy sleep. Tomorrow, he knew, would bring hard choices. Food supplies would run low faster now. He would have to decide whether to seek help, to try to find a rescue organization, to risk letting others know what he had inside his cabin. But for tonight, none of that mattered. Tonight, it was enough simply to offer warmth, food, and a fragile promise of safety. He watched the flames dance, the shadows flicker, and let the deep, slow breathing of the dogs lull him into a shallow doze. As he drifted towards sleep, Warren found himself thinking that maybe, just maybe, he hadn't saved them at all. Maybe they had saved him. Morning crept into the cabin, slowly, pale light seeping through frosted windows and casting long, muted shadows across the wooden floor, where the three dogs still lay curled in a tangled, shivering mass. Warren stirred in his chair, stiff and aching from sleeping upright, but the moment his eyes opened, they sought out his unexpected guests. The fire had burned down to embers, and the cold was starting to seep back into the room. But the dogs remained where they were, pressed close together, as if trying to preserve every last scrap of warmth. Carefully, Warren rose, moving with deliberate slowness so as not to startle them. He fed the fire first, watching as the flames hesitantly caught and grew, pushing back the icy breath of the Alaskan winter. Then he turned his attention to the dogs, his heart sinking as he took in the condition of the smallest one. The injured dog, the one with the patchy gray fur, was clearly worse than the night before. Its hind leg was swollen, the bandage he had hastily wrapped around it darkened and stiff with dried blood. The poor animal whimpered softly in its sleep, shifting now and then, as if trying to escape the pain even in its dreams. Warren knelt nearby, his breath catching in his throat. Every instinct screamed that this dog needed real help, more than he could give with an old first aid kit and good intentions. But there was no veterinarian for miles, and no guarantee that calling for outside assistance wouldn't bring consequences he wasn't ready to face. Wild dogs were rarely given second chances by authorities. Most were considered a threat, something to be controlled, removed, forgotten. Warren couldn't bear the thought of these creatures, who had trusted him enough to cross into his home, being taken away or worse. He rubbed a hand down his face, feeling the roughness of days-old stubble and the deeper weariness that seemed to settle into his bones. There was only one choice, really. He would help them, however he could, even if he wasn't sure how. Taking a deep breath, he gathered the supplies he could find: antiseptic wipes, gauze, some leftover antibiotic ointment from a long-forgotten hunting accident. The dogs stirred as he moved around the cabin, ears twitching, eyes cracking open to follow his progress. Warren approached slowly, speaking in a low, soothing voice that felt strange on his tongue after so many months of solitude. "Easy now," he murmured, kneeling beside the injured dog. "I'm not gonna hurt you. I just wanna help." The largest dog, the one with the scar along its muzzle, rose to its feet immediately, positioning itself between Warren and the injured one. Its stance was protective but not aggressive, more a worried parent than a guard. Warren sat back on his heels, holding out his hands, palms up, non-threatening. "It's okay," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I'm just gonna fix her up. She needs it." For a tense moment, nothing happened. Then slowly the scarred dog lowered its head and backed away a step, allowing Warren to move closer. His heart pounded as he reached out, brushing the injured dog's side lightly with his fingers. The dog flinched, a weak growl rumbling in its chest, but it didn't pull away. That tiny allowance of trust filled Warren with fierce determination. Carefully, he unwound the bloodied bandage, wincing at the raw, angry flesh underneath. The wound was worse than he had feared, a deep gash, possibly from a trap or a sharp branch, already starting to fester from days of exposure. Infection would spread quickly in this weather. He worked meticulously, cleaning the area as best he could, murmuring apologies every time the dog whimpered or jerked in pain. The other two hovered nearby, tense but silent, their loyalty to their injured companion palpable in the cramped, warm space of the cab. When he finally finished, fresh gauze secured around the injured leg, ointment carefully applied, Warren sat back against the wall, letting out a long, shaky breath. His hands trembled from the effort of holding so steady, from the emotional toll of seeing such raw need up close. The dog laid its head down, panting quietly, but the lines of tension around its body had softened slightly. Whether from the relief of clean dressing, or simply exhaustion, Warren didn't know, but he would take it. The morning wore on slowly, the world outside the windows a flat frozen wasteland of endless white. Warren prepared a modest meal for himself, bread and beans warmed over the fire, and set out more strips of meat for the dogs, who ate with a kind of desperate gratitude that wrung his heart anew. Afterward, the three settled back into their heap of tangled limbs and battered fur, the injured ones sleeping deeply, the others keeping silent vigil. Warren sat by the fire, a mug of coffee cooling in his hands, staring at the flames but seeing only questions. What now? He couldn't keep them here indefinitely. His supplies wouldn't last, and winter was only just tightening its grip. But releasing them back into the wild, wounded and starving, felt like a death sentence. Calling authorities felt like betrayal. He was trapped between choices, none of them easy. He shifted in his chair, glancing over at the dogs. The larger two met his gaze without flinching, their eyes solemn, intelligent, almost painfully aware. It was strange, but Warren felt seen in that moment, not just looked at, but understood. His inner turmoil laid bare. He wondered, fleetingly, if they felt the same fear, if somewhere inside their battered bodies, they too were wondering what tomorrow might bring, and whether they would be allowed to stay in this fragile circle of warmth and safety they had stumbled into. The fire crackled, filling the silence with soft sound. Outside, the wind howled mournfully, rattling the window panes and piling drifts of snow against the door. The isolation, once a comfort to Warren, now pressed heavy against his ribs, a reminder that out here, choices mattered more than anywhere else. A mistake could cost lives, not just his own, but those of the beings who now trusted him to protect them. He rose eventually, checking the locks on the doors and windows, an old habit from years spent living alone in the wilderness. But tonight, it felt different. Tonight, it wasn't just about keeping dangers out, it was about keeping hope in. He laid out extra blankets by the fire, nudging them closer so the dogs wouldn't have to move far if the cold deepened. He filled a metal bowl with fresh water and set it nearby. He banked the fire carefully, building it up so it would burn long and steady into the night. As the day faded into evening, Warren found himself pacing the small cabin, unable to settle, his mind spinning with plans and worries. He needed more food, more medical supplies, a plan for what would happen if the injured dog worsened, despite his effort. And somewhere, at the back of his mind, a gnawing fear remained, that this fragile peace was only temporary, that something would come to shatter it, whether a neighbor, a predator, or the relentless indifference of the elements. Warren didn't know, but he felt the shadow of it looming nonetheless. He returned to his chair at last, sinking down heavily, exhaustion dragging at his limbs. The dogs lifted their heads slightly at his movement, but soon settled again, trusting him to watch over them. The firelight painted them in gold and shadow, highlighting every scar, every patch of missing fur, every ounce of resilience, etched into their worn body. Warren sipped at his now cold coffee, and stared into the heart of the flames, feeling a strange mix of sorrow and gratitude swell in his chest. Sorrow for the suffering these creatures had endured, gratitude that by some twist of fate, they had found their way to him. He didn't know if he could save them, he didn't even know if he was enough, but for tonight, he was here. For tonight, they were safe. For tonight, that would have to be enough. As he drifted into a light sleep once again, Warren's last thought was a silent prayer to whatever powers might be listening, not for himself, but for the three broken souls, sleeping in the circle of firelight, for strength, for healing, for another sunrise to find them all still breathing. And somewhere, in the darkness beyond the cabin walls, the snow kept falling, silent and ceaseless, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The next morning arrived cloaked in an even deeper cold, the kind that seeped through the smallest cracks and made even the fire's warmth feel thin and fragile. But inside Warren's cabin, life clung stubbornly to the embers of hope he had fought to build the night before. The three dogs were still there, Huddled close by the hearth, the smallest one sleeping deeply, with its injured leg tucked awkwardly under its body, and the other two pressing against it, forming a living shield against the chill. Warren woke to the sound of their breathing, a soft rhythm that filled the small space with a strange sense of comfort. But as he stretched the stiffness from his joints and moved toward the window, his heart sank. Outside, the world was nothing but a wall of white snow falling thick and fast, driven sideways by fierce winds that howled like wounded creatures across the wilderness. The blizzard had grown overnight into a full-fed storm, cutting him off from any thought of venturing out for supplies or help, and even if he had tried, he doubted he could make it far before the cold swallowed him whole. The realization settled heavily on his shoulders. He was trapped here, with only the dwindling contents of his pantry, a few emergency supplies, and 3 extra lives now depending on him. Warren moved through the cabin methodically, feeding the fire, boiling water for tea, setting out small portions of meat for the dogs, who roused themselves slowly, their bodies stiff with cold and hunger, but their eyes brightening at the sight of food. He rationed carefully, knowing he couldn't afford to be generous, yet he couldn't bear to deny them either. Watching them eat, watching the way the largest one nudged scraps toward the smaller injured dog, ensuring it got its share, Warren felt something shift inside him, a deeper kind of ache that had nothing to do with hunger or cold, but with a longing he had forgotten he even carried, the longing to protect, to be needed, to matter to something beyond himself. As the day dragged on, he tended to the injured dog again, changing the bandages with slow, careful movements that earned him a soft whine of pain, but no real resistance, a fragile thread of trust pulling tighter between them. The wound looked better, cleaner, but infection was a cruel enemy, and Warren knew he was fighting a clock he couldn't see, hoping every small act of care was enough to tip the balance toward survival. Outside, the storm howled, rattling the windows and burying the world in shifting drifts of snow, erasing all familiar landmarks until Warren's cabin felt like a lone island adrift in a hostile sea. He found himself pacing the floor, restlessly glancing at the battered radio sitting unused on a shelf, the thought gnawing at him: should he call for help? Should he risk? Maybe somewhere out there someone could come, could save these dogs properly, could offer them the treatment and shelter he couldn't provide. But the fear held him back, the fear that help would come, not with open hands but with cages, and tranquilizers, and harsh decisions, made by people who saw wild dogs as nothing more than a problem to be solved. He pictured the injured dog, trembling under a stranger's rough hands, dragged away from its companions, alone again in a world that had already shown it so little mercy. He shook his head, forcing the image away. No, not yet. They weren't just animals anymore. They were his responsibility. As afternoon slipped into evening, the storm showed no sign of letting up. The fire blazed high, casting flickering light over the cabin's worn walls, but the sense of isolation deepened, pressing against Warren's mind like the weight of the snow against the door. The dogs slept fitfully, occasionally shifting, letting out soft whines or growls as if wrestling with dreams full of cold and fear. Warren couldn't blame them. He too felt the unease curling in his gut, the instinctual understanding that survival here was balanced on a knife's edge, one unexpected blow away from collapse. To distract himself, he gathered more firewood from the dwindling pile stacked by the hearth, fortified the windows with old blankets to keep out the worst of the drafts, checked and rechecked his limited stores. Every task felt heavy, a reminder of how little stood between them and the frozen world outside. Yet woven through the worry was something else, something warmer, quieter, a bond, fragile but real, growing stronger with each passing hour. When Warren sat near the fire, the largest dog no longer watched him with wary eyes, but with a kind of tired acceptance. The smaller injured dog would lift its head weakly when he approached, a faint thump of its tail betraying recognition. Even the second, more cautious dog had begun to inch closer, sniffing his boots, brushing its side against his leg in silent thanks. These small gestures, insignificant to anyone else, meant everything to Warren. They spoke of trust earned not through force but through patience, through kindness offered without demand. As night fell and the storm outside raged with renewed fury, Warren settled back into his chair by the fire, a blanket wrapped around his shoulders, a battered book open in his lap, though he barely glanced at the pages. His eyes kept drifting back to the dogs, to the way they breathed together in rhythm, to the soft sounds they made, to the stubborn will to survive that burned in their battered body. He thought about all the nights he had spent here alone, listening to the wind, feeling the silence press against the cabin walls, and how different it felt now, with 3 broken souls sharing his fire. The loneliness was still there, but it had softened, its edges worn smooth by the simple presence of others. It scared him, how much he wanted to keep them safe, how much he was already willing to risk for creatures who didn't even speak his language, but whose needs he understood more clearly than he did his own. Somewhere deep in the storm outside, a tree cracked and fell with a distant roar, the sound swallowed almost instantly by the howling wind. The dogs lifted their heads, ears pricking, bodies tensing instinctively, but when Warren murmured low and soothing words, they settled back down, eyes half closed, trusting him to keep the world at bay. And as the fire flickered and the snow piled higher against the cabin door, Warren made another silent promise, not to abandon them, not to give up even when the odds stacked higher with every passing hour. He would fight for them, in whatever small ways he could, for as long as it took. Tomorrow might bring harder choices, deeper sacrifices, but tonight, in the fragile sanctuary of this weather-beaten cabin, surrounded by storm and ice and a bond forged in desperation, Warren and the 3 dogs endured together, holding fast against the cold. The next day unfolded under the heavy hand of the storm still swirling outside, the cabin wrapped tight in snow and ice, as if the entire world beyond its walls had been erased by the blizzard's relentless breath. And inside Warren's small refuge, the air was thick with the slow rhythm of survival, the low crackle of the fire, the occasional restless stir of the dogs, and Warren's own heartbeat pounding in his ears as he sat by the window, watching the endless white with a growing sense of unease he couldn't quite explain, a tension prickling along the back of his neck that told him something was coming, though he didn't know what. The dogs seemed to sense it too, their bodies stiffening, their heads lifting in unison, noses twitching, as they caught something on the wind that Warren's dull human senses couldn't yet perceive. And when the smallest injured dog whimpered, and the scarred larger one moved to stand protectively in front of it, Warren knew that whatever it was close, too close for comfort. He rose slowly, moving toward the door, listening, straining to hear past the howling wind, and there, faint but unmistakable, a crunch of footsteps over packed snow, a shadow moving beyond the swirl of white, a figure approaching his isolated cabin through the storm. His mind raced with possibilities, a lost hiker, a hunter stranded by the blizzard, or something worse, someone who might see the dogs and decide they were a threat to be eliminated, not a family to be saved. He glanced back at the dogs, who were now fully alert, the larger ones growling low in their throats, their bodies tense with a mix of fear and readiness, and Warren felt the weight of responsibility settle even heavier on his chest. Grabbing his heavy coat from the wall, he shrugged into it quickly, slipping a hand into the pocket where he kept a small flashlight and an old hunting knife, not out of a desire to use it, but because he knew the wilderness could be cruel and unpredictable, and he would not let anything happen to the beings who had trusted him with their lives. He opened the door a crack, bracing against the wind, and squinted into the whiteout, his heart hammering against his ribs, and for a moment he saw nothing but swirling snow, until a shape emerged, stumbling forward, bundled so heavily against the cold that it was hard to tell much about them at all. But then a hand lifted in a slow, non-threatening wave, and a voice, muffled by scarf and snow, called out, "Please, I mean no harm." Warren hesitated, instincts warring inside him, but something in the voice, a rawness, a desperation that mirrored what he had seen in the dogs, pushed him to open the door wider. The figure stepped closer, peeling back the layers of scarf and hood, to reveal a woman's face, wind-chapped and pale but determined, her eyes scanning past Warren into the dim warmth of the cabin, catching sight of the dogs, and softening with visible relief. "I've been tracking them," she said breathlessly, as if every word carried a weight she was finally allowed to lay down. I was afraid I was too late. Warren blinked, struggling to process her words, but instinct moved him again, and he stepped aside, motioning her into the cabin, where the fire offered sanctuary against the storm's bite. The dogs bristled, pressing tighter against each other, the larger ones growling low and warning, but the woman crouched immediately upon entering, lowering herself to their eye level, palms open, posture non-threatening, her voice soft and steady as she murmured, "Easy babies, I'm a friend." Warren closed the door against the shrieking wind and turned to face her fully, his voice rough from disuse and suspicion. "Who are you?" She glanced up at him, her face earnest, despite the exhaustion lining it. "Kara," she said simply. "I work with a wildlife rescue center out of Fairbanks. We've been monitoring a group of feral dogs living near the northern range. These three, they disappeared during the last big storm. We thought they might have died out there." Her eyes flicked again to the injured dog, and Warren caught the flash of sorrow in her expression, the same sorrow he had felt when he first laid eyes on their shivering body. "When I found their tracks leading toward this area, I hoped." She broke off as if the enormity of it all choked the words in her throat. Warren swallowed hard, feeling his distrust begin to thaw under the weight of her genuine concern, but still wary enough to ask, "You're not here to take them away?" Kara shook her head firmly. "Only if they need medical help. We can't give them here. I want to see them healed, strong enough to survive again. They deserve that much at least." Her gaze was steady, unwavering, and in it Warren saw a reflection of his own fierce, protective love for the broken creatures sleeping by his fire. He nodded slowly, feeling the decision settle in his bones. "They're hurt," he said quietly, his voice cracking under the strain of everything he had held inside these past few days. "The little one, she's bad off. Infection maybe." Kara's face tightened with professional worry, but she crossed the room with slow, careful steps, crouching again at the edge of the dog's makeshift bedding. She spoke in soothing tones, as she gently extended a hand toward the injured dog, who sniffed cautiously before allowing her fingers to brush its fur. After a brief, careful examination, she sat back on her heels, her expression grave but not hopeless. "You did good," she said, meeting Warren's gaze. "You probably saved her life already by cleaning and wrapping it, but she's going to need antibiotics, real care if she's going to make it through the winter." Warren exhaled shakily, feeling both relief and guilt crash over him in equal measure. Relief that he hadn't failed them completely, guilt that he hadn't been able to do more. "I'll do whatever it takes," he said simply, and in that moment, it wasn't just a promise to Kara, it was a promise to the dogs, to himself, to the fragile bond that had been forged in the heart of the storm. Kara nodded, her smile small but real. "We'll figure it out," she said. Together, they spent the next hour trading information, huddled near the fire while the storm screamed outside, mapping out what supplies they had, what was needed, how they could stabilize the dogs long enough for proper transport when the weather allowed it. Kara marveled at how calm the dogs seemed around Warren, how their eyes followed him with trust that usually took weeks, months to earn. "You're part of their pack now," she said, half joking, half serious, and Warren felt an unexpected sting of emotion at the truth in her word. In this frozen, forgotten corner of the world, he had found a kind of family he hadn't even known he needed, raw and broken and fiercely loyal. As the firelight danced across the cabin walls and the snow pressed tighter against the windows, Warren and Kara worked side by side, two strangers bound by a common purpose, fighting back the darkness one small act of kindness at a time. Outside, the storm showed no sign of relenting, but inside the cabin, a different kind of storm, fear, loneliness, despair began, slowly and stubbornly, to quiet. And though neither of them spoke it aloud, both Warren and Kara knew that the hardest part was still ahead, getting the dogs to safety, getting them healed, giving them a chance not just to survive, but to live free again. But for tonight they had each other, for tonight they had hope. As the storm continued to rage beyond the cabin walls, Warren and Kara set about reinforcing their fragile little world of warmth and trust, moving carefully and deliberately around the dogs who lay nestled in their makeshift bedding near the fire, the injured one sleeping deeply, occasionally whimpering in its dreams, while the two larger companions remained watchful, but no longer hostile toward the newcomers in their lives. their amber eyes following every movement, with a mixture of lingering caution and growing acceptance. And it was this delicate balance of fear and faith that Warren found himself cherishing more with each passing hour, a bond woven not with words or promises, but with small acts of kindness, offered freely in the heart of a merciless winter. Kara unpacked a small bag she had carried strapped to her back, revealing a few precious supplies, salvaged from her abandoned vehicle, a tiny metal kit of antibiotics, a battered medical manual, and a handful of high-calorie food pouches, meant to sustain stranded rescuers during emergencies like this one. And together they improvised a rough plan to keep the dogs stable until the weather allowed for real transport, dividing duties between them, with a silent understanding that grew easier with each shared task, as if the storm outside was not only battering the world beyond the cabin, but also stripping away the walls they had built around themselves. Warren knelt by the injured dog once more, his hands gentle as he checked the wound under Kara's watchful eye, feeling a surge of relief when she nodded approvingly at his crude but effective bandaging, though her expression remained serious as she murmured, "But she's not out of the woods yet," and Warren nodded grimly, knowing all too well how precarious their survival still was, knowing too that he would fight with everything he had to tip the scales in their favor, as they were. Kara told him more about the dog's past, how they had been part of a loosely bonded pack living on the edge of human settlements, scavenging what they could, surviving where others would not, their numbers dwindling year after year under the combined weight of harsh winter, shrinking food sources, and the quiet violence of a world that had no place for creatures caught between the wild and the walls of human towns, neither fully tamed nor fully free. She spoke of traps set by fearful farmers, of poisoned meat left out by angry ranchers, entire litters lost to storms and starvation. And as Warren listened, his heart broke anew for the beings who had somehow endured all that cruelty and still found the strength to trust again, to come to his door and ask for mercy with their bodies shaking from cold and he found himself studying them as Kara spoke, the scarred one who kept a vigilant eye on the door even in sleep, the cautious one who rarely relaxed fully but who now, after days of patience, allowed its flank to rest lightly against Warren's boot, and the smallest one, whose dreams seemed filled with pain but who, even in weakness, sought the comfort of her companions. And he realized with a deep, aching certainty that he was already in too deep, that no matter what happened next, his heart was tied to theirs in a way that could not easily be undone. Night fell early, the storm growing fiercer if that was even possible, and inside the cabin, the fire burned high and steady, a bulwark against the darkness that pressed on every window and door. And Warren and Kara took turns resting in shifts, one always awake to tend the fire, to watch the dogs, to listen for any change in the wind's mournful song that might signal a break in the weather. During one of his turns awake, Warren found himself sitting close to the sleeping dogs, his hand absently stroking the coarse fur of the largest one, who tolerated the touch with a grunt and a shifting of weight, but did not move away. And he thought about everything that had led to this moment, the loneliness that had been his only companion for so long, the quiet resignation he had wrapped around himself like another layer of winter clothing, the slow forgetting of what it meant to care so deeply it hurt. And he realized that somehow, in the midst of the worst storm of the year, he had found something worth fighting for again. Kara stirred across the room, wrapped in one of Warren's old blankets, her breath rising in soft puffs of steam in the frigid air beyond the fire's immediate reach. And Warren watched her for a moment, marveling at how quickly the walls between strangers could fall when survival was at stake, how quickly two people could become allies, companionly in all but blood when life demanded it. He knew they were still facing incredible odds. The storm would not last forever, but when it ended, the world beyond would be no less dangerous, and the journey to get the dogs to safety would be treacherous even in the best conditions. But for now, for this night, they had created a tiny sanctuary, a fragile hope that burned no less fiercely for its vulnerability. Warren closed his eyes briefly, listening to the fire crackle, to the soft sighs of sleeping dogs, to the steady breathing of the woman who had stumbled through a blizzard to save lives she had never met. And he felt a kind of peace settle over him,
a peace he had thought himself too broken to ever feel again.
When he opened his eyes, he found the scarred dog watching him, its golden gaze steady and unreadable, and Warren smiled a little, a tired, genuine smile that felt strange and wonderful on his face, and whispered into the warm hush of the cabin, "We'll get you all home, I promise." The dog blinked slowly, almost as if acknowledging the vow, and lowered its head back onto its paws, trusting him without hesitation, without doubt, and Warren felt the weight of that trust settle over him like a second skin, heavy but welcome. Outside, the storm roared, tearing at the world with furious hands, but inside the cabin, 3 wounded dogs, 1 lonely man, and 1 determined woman weathered it together, bound by the oldest promise of all: "You are not alone, not tonight, not while I still breathe." Morning came again, but this time, it brought with it a fragile, broken silence. The kind that follows a storm, so fierce it feels like the whole world has been scoured clean. And when Warren cracked open the door of the cabin, blinking against the weak light that filtered through the heavy clouds, he saw that the blizzard had finally relented, leaving behind a landscape so thick with snow that the familiar shapes of trees, the outline of the frozen creek, even the worn path he to fetch firewood, had all been swallowed into one endless sea of white. And for a long moment he just stood there, feeling the cold bite into his skin, feeling the weight of what came next settle onto his shoulders like another heavy snowfall he had to carry. Behind him, the cabin remained warm and alive, the fire still crackling, the dogs stirring restlessly, sensing the change in the air. And Kara was already up, shrugging on layers of clothing and checking the supplies they had packed the night before in anticipation of this moment. "It's not perfect," she said when Warren stepped back inside, stomping the snow from his boots. "But it's better than it was. If we're going to get them out of here, we need to move soon before the next front moves in." Her voice was steady, but Warren caught the flicker of anxiety in her eyes, the way her hands lingered a little too long on each item she packed, double-checking, second-guessing, because she knew, as he did, that the journey ahead was going to be brutal, dangerous, not just for them, but for the dogs whose fragile lives they now held between them like something sacred and breakable. The injured dog, though better than she had been, was still weak, her breathing shallow at times, her body trembling with the effort of simply existing, and Warren knelt by her side, feeling the old helplessness creep up his spine as he brushed his hand gently over her flank, murmuring quiet encouragements that neither of them fully believed, but both needed to hear. The other 2 dogs pressed close, their instincts sharp and undeniable. They knew something was coming, knew the quiet days by the fire were ending, and while their trust in Warren was deep enough now that they didn't bolt or growl when he and Kara moved around them, their bodies were tense, watching every shift and movement. Soldiers preparing for a battle they couldn't name but understood all the same. Warren and Kara spent the next hour preparing, improvising with what little they had. They lashed together a rough sled from an old wooden pallet Warren had stored in the shed, layering it with blankets and spare jackets to cushion the ride, tying lengths of rope so they could hitch it to Warren's battered snowmobile, praying that the ancient machine would hold out just a few more miles, long enough to reach the rendezvous point where Kara's team would be waiting with proper transport and medical care. They checked and rechecked the sled, tested the snowmobile's engine until the small cabin filled with the sharp bite of gasoline and exhaust, the mechanical growl of the engine, a strange alien sound after so many days of nothing but wind and silence. And through it all the dogs watched, silent and solemn, their golden eyes never leaving Warren's face. He wondered if they remembered other journeys, other flights from danger, other humans, whose promises of help had ended in cages or worse, and the thought twisted like a knife in his gut, because he knew, more than anything he needed them to understand that this was different, that he would not betray the fragile trust they had given him. Kara moved efficiently, her face set in that determined expression Warren was coming to admire, but when she caught him watching her, she softened just a little, her voice low as she said, "They'll make it. We just have to believe they're strong enough."
Warren nodded, though the lump in his throat made it hard to breathe, let alone speak, and he turned back to the task at hand, forcing himself to focus on each small step, because the bigger picture, the endless miles of snow, the injured dog's fragile heart, the weight of responsibility was too much to carry all at once. When everything was finally ready, they faced the hardest part, getting the dogs into the sled. Warren crouched low, holding out his hands, speaking in the same soft voice he had used that first night, and the scarred dog came first, hesitant but willing, climbing into the sled with a wary glance backward to make sure the others followed. The second dog needed more coaxing, but eventually it too settled beside its companion, pressing close, and Warren turned to the smallest, the one who had fought so hard just to stay alive. She lifted her head weakly when he approached, and for a moment he thought she might try to stand, but when she collapsed back onto the blankets with a soft whine, he knew he would have to carry her. Gently, so gently, he slid his arms under her body, lifting her against his chest, feeling the painful thinness of her frame, the shallow flutter of her breath, and he cradled her as if she were made of glass, murmuring soothing nonsense as he laid her carefully between the others in the sled, where they immediately curled around her, shielding her with their bodies as best they could. Warren knelt there for a moment longer, one hand resting lightly on the largest dog's back, feeling the silent vow they all carried between them: we go together or not at all. The sled was awkward and heavy, and the snowmobile old crank stubborn choked and sputtered in protest as Warren revved the engine, but it roared to life at last, sending up a spray of powdered snow as they lurched forward, and Kara jogged alongside for the first few yards, checking the stability of the sled, calling out adjustments and encouragements, until they found a rhythm that worked, a fragile, desperate momentum that carried them out into the blinding white. The world beyond the cabin was unrecognizable, the familiar paths buried, the trees bent low under the weight of ice and snow, and Warren had to navigate by instinct and memory, leaning heavily on Kara's guidance, trusting her shouted directions, as they fought their way toward the distant meeting point, where if luck and hope held out, help would be waiting. Every bump and jolt of the sled sent a fresh wave of guilt crashing over Warren, every whimper from the injured dog a knife twisting deeper, but when he dared a glance back, he saw that they were holding together, the three dogs huddled close, enduring the journey the only way they knew how together, stubbornly, bravely, silently promising each other that they would not give up. The wind picked up again as they crossed the open fields, stinging exposed skin, stealing breath from their lungs, but Warren gritted his teeth and pressed on, his entire world narrowing to the battered handlebars of the snowmobile, the shifting weight of the sled behind him, the desperate hope that somewhere just beyond the next rise, salvation waited. When at last the first shapes of the rescue team appeared through the swirling snow, figures waved, a truck idling with its engine running, crates and blankets and supplies piled in the bed, Warren felt something break loose in his chest, a fierce wild relief that left him gasping, blinking against the tears that froze almost instantly on his lashes. They had made against the odds, against the storm, against the fear that had gnawed at him for days. They had made it. He guided the snowmobile the final few yards, easing to a stop as Kara ran forward to help, and together they lifted the dogs from the sled, passing them gently into waiting arms, wrapping them in warm blankets, murmuring soft reassurances, even as the dogs trembled and whimpered from exhaustion and fear. Warren found himself standing back, arms hanging uselessly at his sides, watching as the rescue team worked swiftly and efficiently, checking vital, administering medication, offering comfort in a dozen small practiced ways, and he realized that for the first time in what felt like forever, he wasn't alone anymore, that the burden he had carried by himself in that tiny cabin was now shared by others, and that maybe, just maybe, the dogs had a real chance at life again. Kara came to stand beside him, her face pink with cold but lit with a smile that warmed the frozen air between them. "You did it," she said simply, and Warren shook his head, voice rough with emotion as he replied, "We did it, all of us." He glanced once more at the three dogs bundled together under thick blankets, safe at last, and he felt the weight of the past few days lift from his shoulders, replaced by something lighter, something brighter, a fierce, unbreakable gratitude for the chance to have met it, even for a little while, even to three broken creatures who had found him in the middle of a storm and changed everything.
The cabin felt unbearably empty after they were gone. The absence of the dogs a hollow ache that echoed off the rough wooden walls and seeped into every corner of Warren's heart. As he stood alone in the quiet, listening to the fire crackle and the wind moan through the trees, the sounds somehow sharper and lonelier, without the soft breathing of three battered souls curled up by the hearth. And though he had known from the beginning that he was only a stop along their journey, only a shelter against the storm, he hadn't realized how much of himself he had poured into their survival until they were no longer there to receive it, until the fragile rhythm of care and trust they had built together was replaced by an aching stillness that felt almost unbearable. Warren moved through the cabin in slow, aimless circles, his hands trailing over the blankets still bunched near the fireplace, over the makeshift bedding they had shared, over the half-empty bowls of water he hadn't had the heart to clean up yet, and everywhere he looked, he saw pieces of them, tufts of fur caught in the worn rugs, scratch marks on the floor where they had shifted restlessly, paw prints frozen into the mud just outside the door, and each small reminder cut a little deeper, 1,000 tiny wounds, made all the sharper by the fierce love he had never expected to feel. He made himself sit by the fire eventually, staring into the dancing flames, without really seeing them, his mind replaying the long, impossible days they had spent together, the first hesitant steps through the open door, the shuddering collapse of exhausted bodies onto the rug, the cautious sniffs, the slow blossoming of trust. The days that followed passed slowly, each one folding into the next, like drifting snow, leaving Warren adrift in a strange, quiet emptiness he hadn't expected, because even though he had lived alone for years, even though solitude had once been as comfortable to him as his own skin, something had shifted inside him, something he couldn't ignore or explain away, and now every corner of the cabin seemed to echo with memories of the three dogs who had once filled it with life and fragile hope. Their absence was a living thing curling around him as he moved through the familiar routines of chopping wood, tending the fire, patching the leaks the storm had left behind. And at first he tried to pretend that nothing had changed, that he was simply returning to the life he had built before they came. But it was a lie he couldn't sustain, not when every creak of the floorboards reminded him of a cautious paw step, not when every soft sigh of the wind against the windows called up the image of sleeping bodies pressed close to the hearth for warmth. He found himself reaching out unconsciously sometimes, half expecting to feel the brush of fur against his leg, half hearing phantom whines and gentle growls at the edges of sleep, and each time the sharp stab of loss twisted deeper, a reminder that what had come into his life so unexpectedly had left just as suddenly, leaving behind a hollow that felt too big to fill. Warren spent hours by the fire staring into the flames, replaying every moment he had shared with them, from the first fearful glances, to the slow, steady building of trust, to the way they had leaned into him when the world outside had turned merciless, and he wondered if they were thinking of him too, wherever they were now, if they remembered the rough hands that had been gentle, the soft words spoken into the cold. He imagined the scarred one standing tall and vigilant, at the edge of some new clearing, the cautious one, weaving through trees with quiet grace, the smallest one limping but unbroken, carried forward by the stubborn will to survive that had always burned so brightly in her eyes. And he hoped fiercely, selfishly, that some small piece of him stayed with them, that they carried the memory of warmth and safety as a shield against whatever hardship still lay ahead. Yet even as he clung to those thoughts, Warren knew he was at a crossroads, that the days stretching ahead of him could not be lived the same way as the ones that had come before. Not now, not after everything. The cabin, once a sanctuary from the world, now felt like a cage. The walls that had kept him safe now keeping him apart from something he could no longer pretend he didn't need. Connection, purpose, the simple painful joy of caring for something beyond himself. He thought about Kara, about the rescue team,
about the way they had moved through the storm with purpose and courage, and he realized he envied them, not just their strength but their certainty, their belief that even the smallest lives were worth fighting for. Sitting there in the dim light of a fading afternoon, the fire sputtering low, Warren made a decision that startled him with its clarity, a decision that felt less like a choice and more like a simple acceptance of the truth he had been trying to deny. He could not go back to being the man he was before. He had been given a gift, not just in the trust of 3 broken dogs, but in the reminder that life, however fragile, was meant to be shared, that isolation was not a shield, but a wound, and it was time to start healing. Rising stiffly from his chair, Warren crossed the room to a battered old desk in the corner, pulled open a drawer he hadn't touched in years, and found the thick, dusty envelope that held information about a volunteer program he had once considered joining long ago, before he had convinced himself that he was better off alone. His hands shook slightly as he pulled out the papers, smoothing them on the desk, reading the faded words that spoke of shelters and sanctuaries, of people and animals needing help, of lives waiting to be changed by something as simple as showing up. Warren didn't know if he was strong enough, brave enough to step back into the world after so long, didn't know if anyone would even want his help, but he knew he had to try because the alternative, this hollow, aching existence, was no longer acceptable. Folding the papers carefully, he set them aside for the morning, a small but solid promise to himself, and as he turned back toward the fire, he caught sight of the paw prints still faintly visible near the door, the ones he had refused to wipe away, and he smiled, a real smile, tired and aching but real, because he knew now that those prints were not just reminders of what he had lost, but markers of the path ahead, a trail he could choose to follow, step by step into whatever future awaited him. The night deepened around the cabin, the wind softening to a gentle whisper through the trees, and Warren sat once more by the hearth, the flames warming his face, the shadows playing across the walls, and for the first time in a long time, he did not feel quite so alone.
Several days passed in slow, heavy silence, each one pressing a little more gently against Warren's heart, as the pain of absence softened into something more bittersweet, something he could carry without crumbling. And though the cabin still felt too large, too empty, without the 3 dogs moving through it, the edges of the grief were no longer as sharp, dulled slightly by time, and the quiet hope he had planted inside himself when he pulled out those old volunteer papers. But even so, when the knock came at the door one late afternoon, unexpected sound that cut through the steady hum of the wind, his heart leapt painfully against his ribs before he could even rise from his chair, before he could cross the room and pull open the door to find a bundled figure standing there against the twilight, a familiar smile beneath a dusting of fresh snow, and Kara, cheeks pink from cold and eyes shining, holding out a thick envelope with Warren's name scrawled across it, in a hand he didn't recognize, but somehow trusted instantly. "Thought you might want an update," she said, her voice bright with a warmth that even the chill couldn't touch, and before Warren could find words to respond, she pressed the envelope into his hands, squeezed his shoulder with a firm, reassuring grip, and turned back toward her truck, leaving him standing in the doorway with the letter clutched tightly against his chest, as the wind stirred the hem of his coat, and the snow whispered secrets across the frozen ground. He closed the door with care, moving almost reverently as he returned to the chair by the fire, the letter heavy with promise in his hands, and for a long moment, he simply held it, savoring the feeling of connection, of being remembered, of mattering to someone somewhere beyond these walls. When he finally opened it, his hands trembling slightly with nerves he couldn't name, he found a sheaf of papers inside, a short note from Kara explaining that the dogs had been transported safely to the main rescue center after the storm cleared, and 3 separate updates, one for each of them, written by the caretakers, now responsible for their healing. Warren read every word slowly, carefully, his heart swelling and breaking all at once as he took in the news. The scarred dog, now called Bear by the staff, was recovering well, his wounds healing, his strength returning day by day,
The cautious one, whom they had named Scout, had been the slowest to adjust, but had finally begun to show glimpses of playfulness, glimpses of trust blooming under patient, steady care. And the smaller, the injured one he had carried so carefully through the storm, now known as Lily, was still fragile but growing stronger with each passing day. Her infection cleared, her limp improving, her spirit stubbornly intact. The caretakers wrote of her tenacity, of the way she leaned into gentle hands, now instead of flinching away, of the way she would sometimes sit by the window for hours, watching the world beyond the glass, with wide wondering eyes, and Warren couldn't help but smile through the tears that blurred the words, imagining her there, safe and warm, dreaming new dreams he had once feared she might never live to see. There were pictures too, grainy, printed quickly, but precious beyond measure, images of Bear lounging in a sunbeam, of Scout cautiously accepting a treat from a volunteer's hand, of Lily curled in a soft bed, with a worn toy tucked between her paws, and Warren spread them out on the table with shaking hands, studying every detail, committing them to memory, as fiercely as if he could weave them into his very bones. He read the letter 3 times, maybe 4, before finally setting it aside, leaning back in his chair, and closing his eyes, letting the flood of emotion wash over him without resistance, because for the first time since he had watched them disappear into the white, with Kara's team, he knew with certainty that they were not just surviving, but living, and that made every sacrifice, every fear, every sleepless night worthwhile. He thought about the way they had trusted him without reason, had chosen to stay when they could have fled, had leaned on him in their most vulnerable moment, and he realized that trust was a kind of gift too big to ever truly repay, but maybe, just maybe, he could honor it, could live a life that reflected the courage and hope they had shown him. Warren rose slowly, the stiffness of age and isolation heavy in his limbs, but not in his spirit, and he crossed the cabin to where the volunteer papers still sat neatly folded on the desk, untouched since that night. He had pulled them out, but never forgot. He smoothed them flat again, feeling the roughness of the paper under his fingertips, and this time, without hesitation, he picked up a pen and began to fill them out, his handwriting shaky but determined, each word a step forward, a step out of the long cold season he had built around himself. When he finished, he sat back and looked at the papers for a long moment, feeling the strange, heady mix of fear and excitement swirling in his chest, and then with a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth, he gathered them up and set them by the door, ready for the next supply run into town, ready for the next chapter of his life to begin. The fire crackled warmly behind him, the snow continued to fall softly outside, but Warren no longer felt like a man trapped in the endless winter. He felt for the first time in a long time, like a man on the edge of something new, something bright and fierce and alive, and in his mind's eye, he could see 3 dogs running across a field of unbroken snow, free and fearless, and beautifully, gloriously alive, and he knew he would carry them with him, wherever he went, for the rest of his day.
The morning Warren finally decided to leave his cabin behind for something new dawned cold and bright, the sun casting long golden shafts of light across the snow-covered ground, turning every drift and frozen branch into delicate and beautiful. And as he moved through the cabin packing what little he would need, just a sturdy bag, a few clothes, the letter from the shelter accepting his offer to volunteer, and the worn photographs of Bear, Scout and Lily, he felt a bittersweet ache blooming in his chest, because even though he was ready, even though he knew this was the right step, it was still hard to say goodbye to the place that had been both prison and refuge for so long. Every board of the floor, every stone of the hearth, every scratch and scuff and creak carried memories now, some heavy with loneliness, but so many more etched with the bright, painful beauty of the days he had shared with the 3 dogs, who had found him when he hadn't even realized how badly he needed to be found. He paused by the fire, looking down at the spot where Lily had once curled up into a trembling ball, where Bear had lain on guard,
where Scout had hovered at the edge of trust before finally stepping close enough to let Warren reach out a hand in friendship, and he closed his eyes for a long moment, breathing in the scent of wood smoke and worn leather, and faint traces of fur that still clung stubbornly to the cabin's quiet corners, breathing in the life that had filled this place even in the midst of the fiercest storm. Part of him was scared of leaving behind the known for the unknown, scared of stepping back into a world that had once felt too big, too sharp, too full of things he wasn't sure he could handle. But underneath the fear was something stronger, something steady, the quiet certainty that he was no longer the man who had turned his back on connection, out of fear of being hurt, that he had been changed, and for the better, by the stubborn trust of 3 wounded creatures, who had asked for nothing more than a place to rest, and had given him back his own heart in return. He moved through the cabin one last time, running his hand along the rough wood of the doorframe, the backs of chairs worn smooth by years of use, the little shelf where he had kept the extra bowls of food and water during those long days of storm and silence. And when he came to the door, he hesitated, his hand on the knob, looking back over his shoulder at the home he had built with his own 2 hands, the home that had been both a fortress and a cage, a hiding place and a place of healing. And he smiled, a small private smile, because he knew now that leaving didn't mean forgetting, that carrying the memory of this place and of the lives it had sheltered was a different kind of home, one he could take with him wherever he went. Outside, the world was silent and waiting, the sky a pale, endless blue stretching out over the white fields, and Warren stepped out into it with a steady heart, pulling the door closed behind him, feeling the click of the latch like the closing of a chapter, not with sadness but with gratitude for everything that had brought him to this moment. His truck sat half buried under a thick layer of snow, and it took time and effort to clear it, to coax the reluctant engine into rumbling to life. But Warren moved through the work with a quiet joy, every shovelful of snow, every creak of the old truck's frame under his hands, a reminder that he was still here, still fighting, still moving forward. As he loaded his bag into the passenger seat and climbed behind the wheel, he took a moment to simply sit there, breathing in the cold, clean air, feeling the sun warm his face through the cracked windshield. And he thought of Bear's steady gaze, of Scout's cautious bravery, of Lily's fierce, stubborn heartbeat. And he whispered a soft promise to the promise stitched out of hope and sorrow and fierce, enduring love. I'll honor what you gave me. I'll make it matter. Then he put the truck into gear and rolled slowly down the path that wound away from the cabin, the tires crunching through fresh snow, the world opening wide before him, a world full of risks and unknowns, but also full of life and connection, and endless, aching beauty. The cabin grew smaller in his rear-view mirror, a tiny figure tucked into the vastness of the wilderness, and Warren kept driving, the letter to the shelter tucked safely in his pocket, his heart lighter than it had been in years, carried forward by the memory of 3 brave dogs, who had taught a lonely man that it was never too late to open your heart, never too late to start again, never too late to choose hope over fear, love over loneliness, life over mere survival. And as he crested the final hill before the cabin disappeared from view entirely, he tapped the dashboard lightly, as if in silent farewell, and smiled once more, ready finally, truly ready to see where the road ahead might lead. The first few weeks at the shelter were harder than Warren had expected, filled with long days of cleaning kennels, hauling supplies, mending broken fences, and tending to animals whose trust had been shattered in ways that mirrored the 3 dogs who had once huddled by his fire. And yet, as the days stretched into weeks, as the sharp, aching loneliness he had carried for so long was slowly replaced with the steady rhythm of purpose and connection, he realized he wouldn't trade the exhaustion, the sore muscles, the endless noise and chaos for anything in the world, because every wagging tail, every cautious step toward his outstretched hand, every low, tentative rumble of a purr was a small miracle, a reminder that even the deepest wounds could heal if given patience, kindness, and time. He thought often of Bear, Scout, and Lily as he moved through the shelter, especially when he worked with the dogs, those who cowered in corners, those who barked furiously out of fear, those who trembled under every human gaze, and he found himself speaking to them, the same way he had spoken to his three during those long frozen nights, with a voice low and steady, with movements slow and respectful, with his heart open even when it hurt, even when they turned away, because he understood now that the offering of trust was never wasted, even if it wasn't accepted right away, even if it wasn't accepted at all. The shelter staff quickly grew to appreciate his quiet persistence, his way of reaching the animals who seemed unreachable. And though Warren rarely spoke about the journey that had brought him here, those who worked alongside him could sense that he carried something with him, a story written not in words but in the gentleness of his hands, the patience of his steps, the fierce, stubborn hope that never wavered no matter, but broken the creature before him seemed. There were still hard days when the losses felt like too much to bear, when an empty kennel reminded him too sharply of all the ones he hadn't been able to save. But even on those days, Warren stayed, kept showing up, kept believing that every second chance offered was a thread woven into a larger, stronger tapestry of healing, a tapestry he was honored to be a small part of. Sometimes late at night when the shelter was quiet, and the stars stretched cold and bright overhead, Warren would sit outside on the back steps with a cup of coffee cradled in his hand, and he would think about his cabin tucked away in the frozen wilderness, about the night 3 dogs had scratched at his door, and asked him, without words, to believe in something bigger than survival, believe in love, in trust, in the stubborn, defiant miracle of hope. And he would close his eyes and send a silent prayer into the night, a prayer of gratitude for every moment they had shared, for the way they had broken him open and built him anew. And sometimes on rare and precious days, Kara would visit the shelter with upbringing news that Bear had found a home, with a retired ranger who hiked every day through the mountains, that Scout had been adopted by a quiet family with a sprawling farm where he could roam safely, that fierce Lily was thriving in a small town, with a kind woman who understood that healing could not be rushed, but would come in time with patience and love. Warren would listen to these updates with a quiet, aching joy, feeling the connections stretch but never break, knowing that no matter how far they roamed, a piece of them was forever tied to him, just as a piece of him would always belong to them. A spring thawed the world around the shelter, melting the last stubborn patches of ice into running water, and turning the fields a soft, tender green. Warren found himself smiling more often, laughing sometimes, feeling the life he had almost forgotten how to live, slowly, stubbornly taking root again. He was no longer the man who had turned away from the world out of fear. He was a man who had learned through the quiet courage of 3 broken souls that it was never too late to begin again, that every act of kindness rippled outward in ways he might never see but could always believe in. One evening, as he closed up the shelter and walked the last of the dogs to their beds, he paused at the gate, looking out across the fields bathed in the soft golden light of sunset, and he felt a profound peace settle over him, deep and sure and lasting. He thought of Bear's unwavering loyalty, of Scout's hard-won trust, of Lily's fierce will to survive, and he carried them with him, not as a burden but as a light, a guide for every step he took forward. And as he turned back toward the shelter, the doors swinging open to welcome him home, Warren knew with a certainty that filled every scarred, healing piece of him, that second chances weren't just for the lost, the wounded, the abandoned. They were for all of them, for anyone brave enough to open a door, to offer a hand, to choose love again and again and again, even when it hurt, even when it seemed foolish, because in the end it was love, stubborn and enduring and wild, that made the world worth living in.